Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to receive a call that would change not just your life, but the destiny of every person who would ever live? Imagine being 75 years old, settled in your ways, comfortable in your routine, and then hearing a voice that would shatter everything you thought you knew about your future. This isn't just another biblical story about an old man and his journey. This is the moment when eternity reached down and touched time, when the God of the universe looked across all of creation and chose one man to become the father of faith itself. Abraham didn't know it when he first heard that voice, but he was about to become the cornerstone of a covenant that would echo through every generation. His story would become the foundation for 3 of the world's major religions. His decision would reshape the spiritual landscape of humanity forever. But here's what might shock you. When God first called Abraham, he wasn't even called Abraham yet. He was Abram, living in a city called Ur, surrounded by idols and pagan worship. He was nobody special by worldly standards, just another man in another ancient city. So why him? Why would the creator of the universe single out this one person from all the millions alive at that time? Drop a 777 in the comments if you're ready to discover the profound mystery behind God's choice and how this ancient calling still impacts your life today. Because what happens next in Genesis chapter 12 doesn't just tell us about Abraham's journey. It reveals the very heart of how God works in human history, how he calls ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, and why sometimes the most unlikely candidates become his greatest champions. Trust me, by the end of this exploration, you'll never read this passage the same way again. The call of Abraham stands as one of the most pivotal moments in all of Scripture. But to truly grasp its magnitude, we must first understand the world he was leaving behind. This wasn't just a geographical move from one city to another. This was a spiritual exodus from everything that defined ancient civilization at that time. Ur of the Chaldeans was no small village. It was a thriving metropolis, a center of commerce, culture, and religious activity. Archaeological evidence reveals a city of impressive ziggurats reaching toward the heavens, bustling marketplaces filled with goods from distant lands and sophisticated systems of law and governance. The people of Ur weren't primitive nomads. They were educated, cultured, and wealthy by the standards of their day. They had developed mathematics, astronomy, and literature. They lived in multi-story houses with courtyards and complex drainage systems. But beneath all this impressive civilization lay a spiritual darkness that had consumed the known world. Ur was dedicated to the worship of the moon god Nana, also known as Sin. Massive temples dominated the skyline, and the rhythm of daily life revolved around elaborate rituals, sacrifices, and ceremonies designed to appease a pantheon of deities. These weren't just cultural traditions, they were binding spiritual systems that held entire populations in fear and superstition. Into this world of sophisticated paganism, God spoke. Not to a priest or a king or a scholar, but to a man named Abram, whose father Terah was likely involved in the very idol-making industry that sustained their city's religious economy. According to Jewish tradition, Terah crafted and sold the very gods that people bowed down to worship. Can you imagine the irony? The man God chose to become the father of monotheistic faith grew up in a household that literally manufactured false gods for a living. But here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. Genesis chapter 12 opens not with a detailed explanation of why God chose Abram, but with the sudden, stark reality of the divine call itself. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. Notice the structure of this command. It's not random. God asks Abram to leave 3 specific things, and they're listed in order of increasing difficulty. First, his country. Leaving your homeland is challenging, but people do it for opportunities, for safety, for adventure. Second, his kindred, his extended family and clan. This is harder because it means leaving behind your support network, your cultural identity, your sense of belonging. But third, and most difficult of all, his father's house. This meant leaving behind everything that made him who he was, every relationship that defined his identity, every source of security he had ever known. Think about what God was asking. This wasn't just emigration. This was complete severance from everything. Abram had familiared no GPS, no road map, no travel guides. God didn't even tell him where he was going. The destination was simply, a land that I will show thee. Would you leave everything you've ever known to go to a place you've never seen, based on a voice you've never heard before, toward a promise you can't fully understand? But then comes the promise that changes everything. God doesn't just ask Abram to leave. He tells him what he's going to give him in return. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This promise contains 7 distinct elements, each more staggering than the last. God promises to make Abram into a great nation. He promises personal blessing. He promises that Abram's name will become great throughout history. He promises that Abram himself will become a source of blessing to others. He promises divine protection, that those who bless Abram will be blessed, and those who curse him will be cursed. And finally, the most breathtaking promise of all. Through Abram, every family on earth will be blessed. Do you understand what this means? God was essentially telling Abram that his obedience to this call would impact every single person who would ever live. This wasn't just about personal prosperity or even national greatness. This was about becoming a conduit of divine blessing to all humanity. Through Abram's lineage would come the very salvation of the world. But here's what makes this moment even more extraordinary. Abram was 75 years old when he received this call. His wife Sarai was barren. By every human measure, the promise of becoming a great nation seemed impossible. How could a childless couple in their advanced years become the ancestors of countless multitudes? How could an old man with no offspring become the father of nations? This is where faith intersects with the impossible, where the natural realm gives way to the supernatural. God's call to Abram wasn't based on his potential by human standards. It was based on God's power to create something from nothing, to bring life from barrenness, to fulfill promises that transcend human limitation. The response of Abram reveals the nature of true faith. Genesis 12 verse 4 simply states, "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him." No lengthy deliberation, no negotiation of terms, no demand for additional proof or guarantees. He simply packed his belongings, gathered his household, and began walking toward a promise he couldn't see. This wasn't blind optimism or reckless abandon. This was the response of a man who had encountered the living God and recognized that the voice calling him was worth more than everything he was leaving behind. But let's pause here and consider what this moment reveals about the nature of divine calling itself. God didn't choose Abram because he was the most righteous man in Ur. He didn't select him because he had already proven himself as a spiritual leader, or because he had somehow earned this privilege through good works. In fact, Joshua chapter 24 tells us that Abram's family served other gods on the far side of the river. This man who would become the father of faith was himself steeped in idolatry when God first called his name. This shatters our human assumptions about how God works. We tend to think that divine favor follows human merit, that God chooses people who have already demonstrated their worthiness. But Abram's story reveals a different truth entirely. God's calling is not based on our past, but on His purpose. It's not founded on our qualifications, but on His grace. He doesn't wait for us to clean up our act before He invites us into His plan. He calls us from wherever we are and transforms us through the journey itself. The timing of this call is also significant. Why did God wait until Abram was 75? Why not call him in his youth when he had more energy, more years ahead of him, more physical strength for the journey? Perhaps because God wanted to make it unmistakably clear that what was about to unfold couldn't be attributed to human vigor or natural ability. When an elderly man becomes the father of nations, when a barren woman conceives, when impossible promises come to pass, no one can claim it was achieved through human effort alone. There's something else hidden in this passage that often goes unnoticed. When God says, "Get thee out," the Hebrew word used is lecha, which literally means go to yourself, or go for yourself. This wasn't just a geographical relocation. It was a journey of self-discovery, a pilgrimage to become who God intended Abram to be all along. Sometimes we must leave the familiar not just to go somewhere new, but to become someone new. The person Abram was in Ur could never fulfill the destiny God had planned for Abraham. The transformation required separation. Consider also the profound loneliness of this calling. Abram wasn't joining a movement or following a crowd. He was stepping out alone, guided only by a voice that others couldn't hear, and a promise that others couldn't see. This is often how divine callings work. They isolate us from the comfortable consensus of our culture and set us on a path that others might consider foolish or extreme. Faith, by its very nature, often requires us to walk alone before we can lead others. The promise itself deserves deeper examination. When God said Abram would become a blessing to all families of the earth, this wasn't just ancient Hebrew poetry. This was a prophetic declaration that would echo through millennia. Through Abram's lineage would come the patriarchs, the prophets, the kings of Israel, and ultimately the Messiah himself. Every promise God makes to humanity, every covenant he establishes, every act of redemption he performs can be traced back to this moment when an elderly man in ancient Mesopotamia said yes to an impossible calling. But here's what makes this story so personally relevant to us today. God's call to Abram establishes a pattern that he still uses. He still looks for people who are willing to leave their comfort zones for his purposes. He still chooses the unlikely, the overlooked, the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. He still makes promises that seem impossible by human standards and then proves his faithfulness through those who dare to believe. The question isn't whether God is still calling people today. The question is whether we're still listening. In a world filled with noise, distraction, and competing voices, do we have the spiritual sensitivity to recognize when the Creator of the universe is speaking to us? And if we do hear his voice, do we have the courage to respond like Abram did? What strikes me most about this passage is how it reveals God's heart for all humanity. This wasn't just about blessing one man or even one nation. From the very beginning, God's plan was global. His covenant with Abram was designed to reach every tribe, every tongue, every people group on earth. The same God who called Abram from Ur is still calling people today from every corner of the world, inviting them to be part of his redemptive plan for humanity. The journey that began with these words in Genesis 12 continues today. Every person who chooses to follow God, every act of faith, every step of obedience is connected to this moment when Abram first heard the call and decided to answer. We are all, in a very real sense, children of this promise, heirs of this covenant, participants in this ancient story that is still being written. So here we stand, thousands of years later, still marveling at the profound simplicity of Abram's response to the divine call. In a world that demands guarantees, detailed plans, and risk assessments before making any significant decision, Abram shows us what raw faith looks like. He heard the voice of God and he simply went. No committee meetings, no feasibility studies, no backup plans. Just obedience wrapped in trust, walking toward a promise he couldn't yet see. This ancient story isn't just historical narrative. It's a mirror reflecting the very heart of how God still works today. He's still calling ordinary people from ordinary places to participate in his extraordinary purposes. He's still choosing the unlikely, the unprepared, the overlooked to carry his promises forward. And he's still asking the same fundamental question he asked Abram. Will you trust me enough to leave what you know for what I have planned? The legacy of that 75-year-old man from Ur didn't end with his death. It exploded across history, shaping nations, establishing covenants, and ultimately bringing salvation to the world. Every act of faith, every step of obedience, every yes to God's calling adds another chapter to the story that began with Abram's departure from his father's house. The call of Abraham reminds us that God's plans are always bigger than our understanding. His timing is always perfect even when it seems impossible, and his faithfulness always exceeds our faith. When he calls your name, when he asks you to step into the unknown, remember this ancient truth. The same God who turned a childless nomad into the father of nations is still in the business of making the impossible possible. If this story has stirred something in your heart, Drop a comment below sharing how God might be calling you to step out in faith today. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the profound truths hidden in Scripture. Until next time, may you have the courage to answer when you hear His voice calling your name